of coal seams. And then what does the radiation of mammals and birds at the KPG boundary explain? We'll talk about the radiation of mammals. It's not geology, but it's very important for evidence of a worldwide flood. And then a brief conclusion, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. So what does the Bible tell us about the flood? You know, there's probably more written about the journeys of Paul than the Genesis flood in the Bible. But there's some very key words here that you need to, and phrases you need to kind of look at. You know, it talks out about rain, 40 days and 40 nights of rain, which I think was extremely heavy. And then it talks about all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open. Now, when the Bible calls something a great deep, you better believe it was deep. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, bear up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. The waters prevailed and were increasingly great. All the high hills were under the whole of heaven were covered. And 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Now, Ellen White talks about how the mountains of the earth weren't like today. They were more maybe small or more hilly. And that might fit in with the height of the water. One thing that's important that we realize is that the longer God allowed that water to last on the earth, the more it would damage the earth. So God was trying to get it done quick, what he had to do, and then get rid of the water as soon as he could. Otherwise, we would have had more of a catastrophe. We had an ice age right after the flood. And we'll talk about that briefly. The other important thing is every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, not the water. So I put this in here. There's no mention of marine creatures all being destroyed. We know that not all the marine creatures were destroyed at the flood. And then the waters prevailed for 150 days. And let me tell you, water like that on the earth for 150 days can move massive amounts of sediment. Okay, and then the tops of the mountains were seen after the 10th month on the first day. I forget how many, was that 150 days? I think something like that. Yeah. And then in the New Testament, Matthew 24, the days of Noah were similar to the days before his return, where people were unaware until the flood came. So Jesus talked about Noah. Jesus preached he talked about the flood. The world population was warned, but did not heed the warnings of the coming catastrophe. I think a lot of people knew about it. I don't know exactly how many people were on the earth at that time, but I think we were talking about there might have been quite a few. So, and then, was the flood regional or was it worldwide? You see the verse in Genesis 9:11, to destroy the earth. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. And every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. So, you know, these tell you that this was worldwide. This wasn't just some local flooding. Where they get this idea is after the flood, after the Genesis flood, and the waters were receding, there was a massive amount of ice form in the northern hemisphere, which we call the Ice Age. And this could have happened very rapidly because you had so much moisture in the air, and the earth began cooling very rapidly because there was so much tectonics going on land and in the ocean.
What's tectonics?
Movement of the continents of the earth. And then an asteroid hit the Chicxulub Peninsula, and you know where that is, in Mexico or the Gulf of America, that area. There's very good evidence that there was an impact by an asteroid. I spent a day at a lecture on several men talking about the evidence for the impact. And you can even see the outline of the crater, part of it from space. But this was a massive impact. But I don't believe that it killed the dinosaurs, for example. I think the dinosaurs were dying and died before that. Then the impact hit. That gets into a whole different topic, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But the impact was a bad day for most animals, let's put it that way. And what's interesting is if you take a globe, you know, like a desktop globe, and you find out where the impact hit, and you put a hole right through the globe and you come out the other side, it will come out exactly in India where there was a huge discharge of lava that came up on the surface of the earth. It was the largest discharge that we know of. It's called the Deccan Traps. I don't know if you've heard of this name before. But at the Deccan Traps, 1 million cubic kilometers of lava came up on the earth. A million cubic kilometers. You know how big a kilometer is. Think of this was so massive that it would have changed the atmosphere and the climate on the other side of the earth. So you had an impact in the Chicxulub Peninsula, and then you had the Deccan Traps, all about the same time. The geologists think it happened almost very, very soon after. So if the flood didn't get you, these two impacts would have. These two events. So the earth went through a tremendous amount, more than we'll ever know, during this period of time. Now, let's look at some civilizations and what they said about the flood. Just about every civilization had a flood story. I find this fascinating because these people, they didn't have cell phones and they didn't have satellites. They were isolated and they all had these stories. And the stories they had the ark, they had the flooding because man was evil. The Babylonians would say something in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's several tablets on this. They talk about the ark, the destruction of humanity, some animals saved, but then they throw in multiple gods because they believed in multiple gods. And this originated from the Sumerians, not Sumerians, the Sumerians, the Sumar area, where Abraham came from. Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. The Sumars were the very first nation that we know of on earth, the first civilization in Mesopotamia. And they had a record of the flood. And I believe that the Babylonians borrowed that from the Sumars who were there first in the Fertile Valley. Now, a lot of historians say that the Hebrews borrowed the story of the flood from the Babylonians. And you'll see this in history books. And I don't know how on earth they can do that. Who would ever think that a Hebrew would borrow information from the Babylonians because they despise their gods, you know? So, and then even the Chinese had a story of the flood. So it's very interesting. And it goes on and on. You can find these on the internet, by the way. In ancient India, they talked about a catastrophic flood. They were instructed how to build a boat and repopulation of the earth. Greece, the Mayan Aztecs. Now, this is pretty interesting. They believed that their gods were punishing them because of their immorality. I thought that was interesting. The Mayans, whatever happened to them, we don't really know what happened to the Mayan civilization, but I believe that it was volcanoes that drove them off their land because they lived right near some major volcanoes. That gets into geology. Okay, so we'll move forward here. Even Europe had stories of the flood. The Finnish, all these countries. So this is kind of like a geologist Bible, I guess you could say. This is a form of